This video I'm going to be explaining monolithic versus microservice architecture. Monolithic architecture is better than microservice architecture in that it is faster to develop at first than microservice due to the simplicity of having an application based on one code base. Easier to develop than microservice because when an application is built from one code base, it is easier to develop. Easier to deploy than microservice because having one executable file or directory makes deployment easier. Faster to test than microservice because a monolithic application is a single centralized unit. End-to-end testing can be performed faster with a distributed application. Easier to test than microservices. With microservices, a multitude of independently deployable components makes the software testing much harder if to compare to a monolithic versus microservice architecture. Easier to debug than microservices because with all the code located in one place, it's easier to follow a request and find an issue. Less complex to develop for than monolithic architecture. Microservices add more complexity compared to a monolithic architecture since there are more services in more places created by multiple teams, cheaper to develop for than microservices. As microservices, each new microservice can have its own costs for the test suite, deployment playbooks, hosting infrastructure, monitoring tools, and more. Greater standardization than microservices, which suffer from the lack of standardization. Without a common platform, there can be a proliferation of languages, logging standards, and monitoring. Greater simplicity than microservices. Since microservice architecture is a distributed system, you have to choose to set up the connections between all the modules and databases. Also, as long as such applications include self-sufficient services, all of them have to be deployed independently. Microservice architecture is better than monolithic architecture in that it's easier to change in contrast to monolithic, where making a small change in a single function requires compiling and retesting the entire platform, which goes against the agile approach today's developers favor. Faster to develop at late, in contrast to monolithic, where a large monolithic application makes development more complex and slower the longer it goes on. Easier to scale, in contrast to monolithic, where you can't scale individual components. Code complexity, you can build a tower to a certain height with no trouble, but as it continues to grow, eventually the instability of the foundation will cause it to start shaking. The same thing with a monolith. When a monolithic application scales up, it becomes too complicated to understand and segregate the ownership of the pieces. In addition, a large code base within one application is harder to maintain. More reliable in contrast to monolithic, where if there's an error in any module, it could affect the entire application's availability. Easier to adapt to changing technology in contrast to monolithic, in that any changes in the framework or language affects the entire application, making changes often expensive and time-consuming. More flexible in contrast to monolithic, which is constrained by the technologies already used in monolithic. Easier to deploy in contrast to monolithic, where a small change to a monolithic application requires the redeployment of the entire monolith. More agile, flexible scaling. If microservices reaches its load capacity, new instances of that service can be readily deployed to the accompanying cluster to help relieve pressure. We are now a multi-tenant and stateless with customers spread across multiple instances. We can now support much larger instance sizes. Continuous deployment, frequent and faster release cycles. Before we could push out updates once a week, and now we can do so about 2 or 3 times a day. Easier to maintain, easier to test. Teams can experiment with new features and roll back if something doesn't work. This makes it easier to update code and accelerates time to market for new features. Plus, it's easier to isolate and fix faults and bugs in individual services, independently deployable, since microservices are individual units, they allow for fast and easy deployment of individual features. The more flexible microservices architecture allow teams the freedom to select the tools they desire, and more reliability. You can deploy changes for a specific service without the threat of bringing down the entire application. So there you go. That's monolithic versus microservice architecture.